Hi guys, thank you for coming to take a stroll to our podcast booth in our office. Today with us we have Daniel Niedra and we have Lindsay, who are essentially our listing brokers for our project in Kanata. They work with Colliers and they made the drive up today in some pretty challenging weather to come talk to us about the Ottawa market as well as our project in Kanata. So gentlemen, thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, happy to have you guys here. So why don't we just jump right into it? Why don't you talk to us a little bit about yourselves, your backgrounds, and then we'll talk about the Ottawa market and more specifically, obviously, our project in Ottawa.
Sure. Dan Niedra, focused on the industrial sector and the Ottawa market. Been in the business for about 10 years now. Been with Colliers for a little over 1 year. Came from the ownership side. Before that, working for Manulife, where I really, began to specialize on industrial. At Colliers, I'm representing landlords, tenants. Have a few, big listings on the new development side. So very excited about the Huntmar opportunity and what it presents to the market. First, development, of scale in what is not traditionally an industrial market, but growing population, big tech sector, manufacturing, and a new opportunity for tenants to grow within the west end of the city.
Lindsay, thanks again for having us today. Like Dan, I rejoined Colliers about a year ago. I started my career at Colliers back in 2001. So for the past 23 years, my focus has been on the office leasing side mainly. We'll get to that. But I've spent some time at CBRE, Avis & Young, but happy to be back at Colliers and calling it home again. As I said, my focus has been on the office side, and then more particularly, and as it relates to the development we're going to talk about, I dedicate a lot of my time to the tech sector in Ottawa, where we get a lot of mixed use, so manufacturing, assembly, warehousing as well, but usually with an office and engineering component as well. So Dan and I complement each other very well for the development we're going to talk about.
Very cool. So how about let's start more high level, then we'll work our way down to the project itself and the opportunities and so on, but just kind of positioning Ottawa within the rest of Canada. A couple of comments on the industrial market in Ottawa, type of tendencies that you're seeing, the type of users. You had mentioned manufacturing, you were talking about tech. Where is Ottawa today versus where it was a few years ago? Where do we see it going? And again, how does it fit in the rest of Canada? So why don't you guys just give us a bit of texture on that?
Sure. So, the Ottawa industrial market is one of the smaller of Canadian, major markets. Just shy of 46 million square feet. Traditionally been, a very stable market. Which has experienced tremendous growth over the last 5 years, much like the rest of major markets across the country. It's a strong manufacturing base, especially in the West End with respect to high tech. Ottawa is always considered Silicon Valley North. Which it seems to be entering a phase of reemergence with new large tech groups experiencing growth. The last 5 years, I think we've seen a lot more growth with respect to distribution. Last mile, the shift to e-commerce has absolutely made a big impact on the Ottawa market. So that's definitely where we're seeing a lot of growth, in addition to groups in the construction and building supplies. They're taking large pockets within the new development, which is there's been very little of over the last decade. Before 2 years ago, it had been close to a decade of run without any new spec industrial product of any scale. So it's an exciting time within the auto industrial market for tenants to find opportunities to get into new generation space.
I think I would add to that Ottawa is a very innovative city, especially when we're thinking about the tech side of things, not necessarily the pure, warehousing or industrial uses. Everyone remembers the name Nortel. When they wound down, I've lost track of how long ago that was, but when they wound down, a number of large companies, Avaya, Sienna, there were about 4 or 5 companies that purchased large divisions from Nortel as they wound things down. But what also happened is, a number of very intelligent people left Nortel, got together, and started their own thing. So throughout Ottawa, but predominantly in the West, we saw, a large number of these startup tech companies start to, flourish. So now 10 or 15 years later, we're really reaping the benefits from that and the brain trust, those people remaining in Ottawa. And as one of the tenants we're talking to now for Huntmar is a perfect example. It's a homegrown company. They've since been acquired by a bigger brand, but they maintain autonomy and they're doing their own thing. But it's a pretty common theme that we see. So we're lucky in Ottawa to have that. It really distinguishes us, I think, from other markets and other industrial markets.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point. You had referenced the fact that Ottawa is, obviously a smaller market in comparison to the Torontos, the Montreals, Vancouvers. But what I find interesting is that it's still, vacancy rates are still very low. When you compare it on the industrial side to other cities with regards to the average national net rent per square foot, it does perform very well. So for a smaller market, it does pack a punch. Yeah. And obviously strategically located near Toronto and so on. So how much of the Toronto market would you say is as a result of a spillover from proximity to Toronto? And how much would you say is actually just Ottawa homegrown? And Montreal as well, obviously, because it's technically close to both major cities.
Right. I don't know. How would you answer that, Dan?
I think Ottawa stands very well on its own, driven by the local population and industry locally. But Ottawa is a strategic position for a lot of organizations looking to service the province of Quebec and Eastern Canada without being there, still operating within Ontario. So a very strong economic base and a strategic location for a lot of organizations.
And I think we're seeing that with logistics lately. Ottawa or the surrounding area has definitely been identified as strategic locations for. Amazon's a perfect example, but there's others. So maybe less focus on Montreal and Toronto as we've traditionally seen, and more exploration in Ottawa,
which I think is great, and it's a huge opportunity, right? So. Let's talk about a little bit the existing product, because I think one of the benefits of our project is obviously we're looking at doing something that's new, top of the line in terms of product itself. Obviously, there in Montreal, for example, spec building is not something that's been traditional in Quebec, and we have a lot of, let's call it, mature inventory. Tell us a little bit about Ottawa, and then we'll dive a little bit more into the project. But I think that's an interesting story to tell as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very similar situation, just on a much smaller scale. I think the Ottawa market is about 1/10 the size of the greater Montreal area. But, that 46 million square feet, average age of inventory is over 40 years now. There's been very little new spec development of any scale over the past decade. Only the last couple of years that we've seen, a few projects go up in the East End. Huntmar is, the first, in the West End of scale, being, close to 500,000 square feet. So it presents, a real exciting opportunity for tenants to get into new generation, Class A space with, modern specs, from clear heights, column spacing, truck turning, circulation, loading, power, everything.
Yeah.
It's the kind of opportunity that tenants have been, looking for a long time, to get out of, some of the smaller bay buildings that they've grown and expanded into and just made do with what they have, but waiting for that opportunity to find, new gen space to get into, and right size and improve their operations.
Economically too, like we've seen additional rents in some of these older buildings touch $8-9 a foot. We see it on the office side too. Like most of the office buildings in Kanata are 20 to 30 years old now, and the additional rents are out of control. So it's nice to see new construction and have the opportunity to play with a $3 or $4 advantage right off the bat on the additional rent. Like on 100,000 feet, that's meaningful.
Yeah,
Right.
I totally agree. And considering the fact that the market's tight in terms of vacancy and the fact that the vast majority of the inventory is mature, again, using that term to talk about how old the existing buildings are, that's where I see a huge opportunity with our project. Obviously from a performance perspective, you mentioned certain elements that the building kind of offers, or the buildings offer, that you won't necessarily find elsewhere. How about you talk a little bit about the location of where we're going, where our project is, and the opportunities that you see related to that, because you had mentioned that it's the first major one on the West End. So just for people that are listening, so that can understand how Ottawa has evolved over the years, why don't you bring us to where we are today and why our location is strategic, and the opportunities that come along with it?
Do you want to talk about the East End maybe a bit, Dan? And how, because the East End is where, like a lot of cities, that's where, the majority of our pure industrial warehouse space is.
Yeah. It is about half the market located within pretty much a 2-kilometer radius in the East End, and this is just less than 10K east of the downtown core. So when you look at an aerial, Ottawa is very densely built up. In a small pocket of the East End, which is half the inventory. That's traditionally where all the tenants have wanted to be. Proximity to the 417, to Montreal. There's been very little industrial development in the West End. The biggest sort of story, as of late, has been Amazon building, a 2.7 million square foot multi-story distribution center in Barrhaven, which is not too far from Kanata, sort of anchoring, a sort of a new node within the West End. Different sort of, strategic location there with respect to, the West End population, as well as, access to the 416 down to the 401 in Toronto. But yeah, Huntmar and Kanata, being a population with, 100,000 plus residents, it is a sort of a node that sustains itself, but there's been very little opportunity for industrial tenants to have a footprint there to service the growing population.
Yeah, in Kanata, the West has predominantly been an office market, but as time goes on and the tech sector evolves, we're definitely seeing more demand for the pure industrial warehouse, but space that can be that's flexible, that we can convert to flex if Lockheed needs a 50,000 foot lab. There have been industrial developments in the West, but usually on a on a design build basis. Lockheed Martin built a building. Sanmina has built a contract manufacturing building, but that was always to satisfy an existing demand, right? An existing need. So to me, this is the first real step and entry where someone has decided, let's give pure industrial a shot and see what happens, right?
Let's bet on it.
And I think it's the right having worked in that market for 20 years, I really do believe it's the right bet for sure.
It's time.
Kanata is out of traditional flex space where a company could build a lab or a few production lines. The space just doesn't exist. We run into it every day with tenants who have a need for, it's usually a 50-50 mix of office to specialized space, but it just doesn't exist right now.
Yeah, these are tenants that actually build things.
Yeah,
it's traditional tech. So they do have a requirement for large floor plates and floor space to build those things, whatever they may be.
And in a way, that market kept Ottawa going through the pandemic, because those people were they didn't stop. The federal government workers stopped going into the office. They worked from home, but these tech firms, they had to be on the line. They had to be in the labs doing their thing, and it was refreshing to see over the last 4 years, and to me it's just sort of picked up good momentum during that period.
Well, I find that interesting. I mean, obviously the office market is one that we've all read in the newspaper for the last 4 years, how it's totally changed as a result of the pandemic. But I think the same can be said for the industrial market, which technically did benefit from the pandemic in a pretty significant way. Talking about our project itself, so I'm going to put you guys a little bit on the spot, so that you can, obviously you guys know our project intimately well. Why don't you just tell us high level some details about what we're developing there, and then we'll talk a little bit in terms of how we compare our product versus existing product, because obviously we are, I think you had mentioned it earlier, Dan, tenants who are coming up for renewal, we want them to come look at our building. And I think that there is definitely a great story to tell, and a compelling one to say, you know what, let's go look at something new. Evaluate obviously the pricing delta versus a renewal, but also what's the benefit of being in a new building, which I think is really what it comes down to. What are we going to gain as a tenant, as a user, as an occupier by going to these new type of developments? So again, high level in terms of the project itself, and then putting yourself in the shoes of an existing user in the surrounding area. Why should they come see our property? Why would they benefit from being on a property as opposed to their existing product, which you would reference is decades old?
Yeah. I mean, so I think from a tenant's perspective, I mean, this is a Class A development of scale. It's just shy of 480,000 square feet in a strategic location in the center of Kanata. The abundance of amenities nearby, highly skilled labor force in the immediate vicinity. It's a big differentiator from product in the East End, where if you want to go get lunch, there are amenities right across the street, as opposed to having to get in your car and drive somewhere.
Which you do in most other parts of the West.
Right.
So Dan's not kidding. Like this is a real opportunity for someone who wants to be near, restaurant, service, retail.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah, and recreation as well.
Yeah.
I mean, Kanata really is, a node that kind of sustains itself. There are people who live in Kanata and they haven't been downtown in a year. It serves all their needs, work, play, and they're good. No need to leave. So this project is very well situated within the market for transport. So on the logistics side, and then again, access to labor and the amenities to support their workforce.
And then down the road, if we ever get our light rail transit system figured out, we will. But some bumps along the road. We're probably closer proximity than anybody else to a future light rail stop, which will immediately service and benefit those that work at Huntmar.
Yeah. The plant does have now passed right by the site, so it's a brilliant location from a transit standpoint. Parking as well. With the property itself having a good parking allocation that you'd expect of a Class A facility, and having a shopping center right across the street, which might present some opportunity for additional overflow. But apart from that, it's a Class A project, which will enable tenants to really achieve their operational efficiencies that I think a lot of tenants are struggling with right now, being kind of stuck in aging inventory. So the types of tenants that we're going after, for one, groups that are looking to have a West End presence and never had an opportunity before to do that. Tenants that are rolling and looking for an opportunity to right size their operation and get into new gen space. And that could be tenants with more of a flex type operation, manufacturing. And then, of course, logistics, which is what these buildings were designed to support.
Yeah, I think another differentiator, one that people on the outside may not see until they get more familiar with the project, but it's Rosefellow themselves. It's been more than refreshing to. There's no roadblocks, right? Dan and I are constantly encouraged to. Yeah, don't be shy to don't be scared to bring us anything. We'll find a way to make it work. If it's reconfiguring the exterior or really anything physically about the building, we'll do our best to find a way. We've worked on we've put proposals out to tenants that have included improvement allowances that I've never seen before with industrial buildings. So showing flexibility on the financial side as well has really made our jobs easier thus far.
Yeah, I think what we all know is that the team at Rosefellow are deal makers.
Yeah,
they creatively and put a deal together. Is recognizing that.
Well, we got to help you, right? And something that I can tell you that is in the DNA of Rosefellow is that we don't like saying no to deals. If there's a deal there, we want it. We definitely put ourselves in the shoes of the occupier, understanding where their soft spots are, where their concerns are, and we try to work around that. So our motto is definitely that we don't lose any deals.
Yeah. Here's another small example, but I'll never forget this story. I went to Sam maybe a month ago with my tail between my legs with a tenant who was asking, they had a designer, this designer's done their work for years, and they wanted to take a crack at a test fit, make sure they fit, see how much space they need. And I went to Sam with my tail between my legs asking, hey, Sam, I'm sure the answer is no, but would we fund a test fit to get this group going and really feel out their level of interest? And he said, that's almost standard at Rosefellow. We do that all the time. And you don't get that with most industrial developers, has been my experience anyway.
Well, we have to give you all the chances you have, but we also want the tenant or the prospective tenant to sit there and be like, you know what, I do want to commit to a long-term or medium-term lease with Rosefellow, because the actual process of getting to that finish line is one where they can really recognize the collaborative environment that we're trying to create, right? We've all been in the business long enough where, it was for a long time, and still to a certain extent today, it's landlord versus tenant. Right. And, one of the reasons that I decided to join Rosefellow is because I don't like that approach. I'm very much tenant and landlord.
I'm with you.
And treat people the way you want to be treated, and good things will come from that. And that's something that we definitely want you guys to have in your arsenal, to be able to walk in a room. We want a tenant to be able to look at it and say, okay, if I'm weighing pros and cons, and let's say that financially we are equal in terms of obviously rent and so on and so forth to a competing product, for example. Well, then after that, they evaluate the non-monetary factors. And we want them to look and say, okay, but it's been so much, again, like I mentioned, collaborative, transparent. We do what we say what we do. We want to sign with them. That's where we want to be. So we definitely think that that's something that adds value. I'm happy that you guys recognize that as well.
But you're right. I don't mean to interrupt you. Getting to that finish line, as you call it, it's rarely easy, right?
Everyone would be doing it if it was.
Right. So, the easier we can make that process or that objective as a team, the better off everybody is instantly.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And I've always tried to put myself in the shoes of the person sitting in front of me. And from the user's perspective, a lot of times the person that you're going to be dealing with has to go upstairs and make a recommendation and put their name on it and say, no, this is the right choice for our organization, is to go to this project, or so on and so forth. Knowing that, you want them to look good in their decision.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? You want to make sure that they can turn around and say, no, these guys delivered on everything they said they would. It's rare that we can always say yes, right? That's why these discussions are ongoing, because if we just said yes to everything, then first of all, we wouldn't be in business, but second of all, it's just not realistic. But it's all in the way that you try and find solutions, I think. But that being said, I think that that's something that you guys are definitely bringing to the table when you're communicating with prospects. And, just in our short time that we've dealt together, even whatever opportunity there is, we're willing to go for it, right? Even if it's not super straightforward, we have no problem being proactive. We want to make noise. Obviously the term disruptor has been used for a long time, but it's not just a disruptor to the market, but it's also, we're here to shake the trees. You know what I mean? So I'm happy that you guys recognize that. So now going back to looking at a user who's sitting, in our market and near Kanata or in Kanata, who's got a renewal coming up, saying, okay, market's tight. Do I renew? Do I look at doing something new, like going to obviously our property? If you put yourself in their shoes and the landlord puts a renewal proposal in front of them, for a tenant who's been there for 10 years, let's say it, right? I'm sure we agree that renewal rate that's going to be put in front of them is going to dwarf what they're paying in their existing lease, right? So in terms of pricing, when they're evaluating a renewal versus coming to a new property like ours with a performing building from an environmental perspective, ceiling heights, you were mentioning the turning radius, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Tell me why, because obviously if the pricing delta was significant, then all of a sudden the tenant says, it's just not worth it. But why is it worth it for somebody who's sitting in an existing building with a renewal coming up to say, all right, you know what, let's go look at that and let's move to our Hummer project because it makes more sense? Why don't you just kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Something that comes to mind, because it's real, we've seen it a few times now. A couple larger groups have been able to get much more efficient and actually reduce their footprint by 25 to 30%. So that's significant, right? And when you line that up against maybe a lower rent to renew, it can balance out pretty quickly. So I think size of the footprint is a big factor that we've seen already.
Yeah, and then it depends on the business, but for logistics groups, typically if they're an older product, they're working with a much lower clear height, so there's that clear height differential, which it's pretty easy to demonstrate the incremental value of adding another 8 to 10 feet. So even if you're paying the new development premium on a face rate basis, it's pretty easy to convey the additional value on a volume basis. And then the other piece is operating costs, which older product, inevitably there's going to be more capital, more amortization on the recovery side. So getting into new product with very low operating costs, it almost in many cases it's a wash. So the only variable in the decision to renew or relocate becomes what does it take for us to move and to replicate office improvements in that. So being able to demonstrate what that's going to take in terms of cost is important. But the team at Rosefellow, I think, have been great with getting pricing and working that out in a very timely manner to convey, what a relocation would look like and really help the tenant with that decision-making process.
There's a pride factor too, I think. Moving from an older facility to something that's shiny and new. It's a chance to. We see this all the time. It's a bit of a rejuvenation opportunity for the company, the workforce. Maybe they're going to rebrand, but it's an uplifting experience for the employee base. And having gone through COVID and everything we went through together, it's a good opportunity for a lot of companies to move into something new.
And I'm hearing that more and more now from industrial tenants who, I think a lot of people might think, oh, it's a box. They don't really care.
Exactly. We hear this all the time on the office side, but it's happening on the industrial side too.
Yeah, from the small bay world right up to the larger bay, where the employers care about where they are, where their people are every day, and the experience that their staff have on a day-to-day basis. I think employers are thinking more and more about it, and seeing opportunities to get into Class A product is a great way for them to improve branding and image, but also give their workforce a sense of pride in what they do and where they spend their time. Yeah. And I'm just seeing that more and more.
I think that is so spot on. When I started in the business, which is now several decades ago, I remember touring spaces, and you'd have a decision maker come and call the shots, black and white, right? Where do I park my car? Where's my office going to be? And then the rest, as long as it fit into the criteria that they were looking for, was all good. And then you started to notice that human resources was on the tour.
Just thinking that.
Right? And then all of a sudden the decision maker's there, and not necessarily calling shots, but asking HR, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And so on and so forth. And what does that say? And again, if you talk to tenants, which I know you do, but if you talk to occupiers or whatever, and you ask them, what's your biggest challenge today? And I think it's translated over the last few years exponentially to the industrial market. You ask the occupier, what's your biggest challenge today? And I'm pretty sure that 9 out of 10 of them are going to tell you it's the attraction and retention of talent.
100%.
Right? That's what matters today. And I think what you're bringing up about our project ticks the box to that, which I think today is much, much more relevant than it was before, because you want to attract people, train them, keep them happy, so that you don't have to do that again.
Because that's expensive.
It's expensive and it's inefficient, right? So why don't you just elaborate on that in terms of why our project, we talked about location and so on, but from the employee's perspective as opposed to the employer's perspective, why would you prefer being in our building?
Like, to me, this might sound a little simplified, but brand new modern LED lighting. I know this is going to be a bright space. I know the air is going to be clean, right? The temperature is going to be right. I'm working with a 9-inch slab instead of what 6 used to be standard in a or less. Yeah. It's all those factors that add up. The fenestration, right? And the ability, we've already seen it, the ability to add more if a tenant needs more. Right. So for me, it's a number of really maybe smaller factors that add up pretty quickly. Right.
Yeah, and that end, the actual physical location of the properties. There, the corner of Campo and Hunmar, it's a highly visible location. Yeah. So being able to, tell your friends, your family, where it is that you work, and be able to reference a location that everyone's going to know, I think carries some value, from an employee standpoint.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, real estate, the first thing that you probably all heard the way that I did was location, right? I think it's obviously still extremely relevant, and you kind of referenced that just now, but I think that's also evolved, right? And when you look at, again, if the biggest challenge for an employer is attraction or retention of talent, then you ask yourself, what matters to the employee? And, over the last, several years, I've kept very much in tune as to what matters to employees. And the same things come out over and over, and you guys touched on them. natural light. Huge, right? Air quality, connectivity, and a sense of community.
Yeah.
Those are the things that really come out. And the employer that ticks those boxes well, while making an employee feel valued from a compensation perspective, will have a better chance of retaining that talent and keeping them long term than another employer. Thoughts on that?
I would even add in ESG and environmental sustainability.
We're there.
We could talk about that for hours.
Yeah.
A lot of it's becoming a very important factor corporately, but also for the employees, right? Like they may decide to only focus on one or two companies because they believe and they support in certain ESG initiatives. It's definitely becoming more important corporately. 10 years ago, it was something we talked about. Yeah, we're there, like thumbs up. Now it's a must with more and more companies. I had a meeting last week with a group that said, and I think their lease was 3 or 4 years out. It's a ways out, but he looked us in the eyes and he said, next time we do this is going to be our number one factor to focus on. And he wasn't kidding. I was actually a little shocked. It put things into perspective for me, how real this has become. So the fact that we can talk about this at Huntmar and support it has also been very helpful for Dan and I.
Yeah, well, that's definitely something that we're conscious of in our development. Obviously, when you're talking about industrial product, it hasn't traditionally been viewed
exactly,
fitting into that ESG box. But just having spoken to different users as well, the example that they gave, that one gave me that really stuck out of my head, is said, okay, when we would do our corporate pitch, ESG was one slide at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Today, it's 3 or 4 at the beginning.
At the front, yeah.
And that's why I think what our product is in terms of from our environmental performance and so on and so forth, just comes to talk to that. And you talk to the more institutional type of tenants, because it kind of starts there, right? It starts there, and then it's going to trickle down to, if you'll allow the term, the more mom and pop shops, right? Because I think it's viewed very much, because for a long time it's like, if you want to be in ESG, it costs a lot of money. Mm. But now there's a cost to not being ESG. And then when you do this, you're like, okay, ESG all the way.
Yeah. And we see more and more owners and landlords willing to participate in these programs to lessen the burden on the tenants, right? I had an interesting experience a couple months ago. It was an office tenant, but what we learned was the parent company of the group we were dealing with would penalize. The bottom line of the local group would be affected if they themselves on their own didn't meet certain thresholds for power consumption, water consumption, all those sorts of things. So it's starting to affect the bottom line on a number of companies now. So
there's a glorious opportunity for you guys to talk about our buildings, because obviously we have 2 buildings that are going up at Huntmar. From an ESG perspective, just talk about our environmental performance and so on, so that people that are listening can understand what we're talking about in comparison to older product.
Sure. I mean, like as it relates to this project, there's nothing more, efficient than new. So building, Class A product with, good installation ratings, high performing HVAC systems. I think those are all, critically important and a benefit to moving into, a project like Huntmar.
The LED lighting system, where your competitors right now are scrambling in existing buildings to retrofit and get up to speed, right? And that's not cheap to do it after the fact.
No, and these are real efficiencies, especially in the industrial world where tenants are paying their own utilities. They see the benefit of having efficient building systems,
right?
And it's real. So that's certainly a draw, for tenants, coming out of, aging inventory, moving into a new, Class A efficient product.
Do you see a demand more now from tenants? Is it a question that they'll ask? Will they say, okay, are you LEED? Are you, net zero? What are they asking now from that perspective? Because then they'll go into the minutia of understanding. Because you can throw those terms out there, and it'll mean, okay, there's an efficiency from an insulation perspective, lighting, and so on and so forth. What do you see matters more now than, call it 5-10 years ago?
Why don't we both answer that question? I'll answer it more from the tech sort of flex use. Every single one of them ask about it. Wow. Everybody. You mentioned HR as well. Like, gone are the days of the CFO running this project. It's often run now by HR. So on the office flex lab tech side, everybody asks about it.
Yeah, I mean, in the industrial world, we're seeing fewer tenants targeting the designation, but they're certainly asking the question with respect to, what the building spec is, with respect to LED lighting, or how the building's heated, and asking the questions on efficiency ratings. It's more the actual specifics rather than the designation itself, because I think they understand, what it actually means for them in terms of dollars and cents.
So why don't you scratch the surface a little bit on that? What do you think it means high level in terms of dollars and cents?
So I mean, from a heating and lighting standpoint, typically you'd expect, in your average sort of quality product, you're paying anywhere from $2.50 to $3 a square foot to heat your space and light it. When you move into even if you just retrofit lighting into LED, immediately you see a material impact, which from what I've heard, and now I've never actually seen the numbers myself, but the reduction on your hydro costs could be to the tune of half. Heating, I don't have any specific references on that, but I mean, there's absolutely a material impact when you're in a building that is well insulated, where you're not experiencing heat loss, where your HVAC systems are actually efficient and putting out the right level of heat. I think those are all concrete ways to save money.
Yeah, no, I think from that perspective, it's not only what does it cost for me to be here, but what am I saving to be here, right? And then when you factor in the higher ceiling heights and so on, when you look at it from a per square foot basis, you got to compare apples with apples, right? So when you're comparing something with a lower ceiling height with higher operating costs versus, okay, higher ceiling height, I can do more with my space. So yes, my price per square foot might be a bit different, but I can gain efficiency and I can do so much more. And I'm saving on the other side. Then all of a sudden, somebody who's sitting in a mature product, sitting there being like, okay, it's slowly but surely becoming a no-brainer to move into something that's more performing. Would you agree or disagree?
Much easier to put a small office mezzanine in a building with 32 foot clear compared to 22 feet. So it's most group, I wouldn't say most, but the opportunity is there right off the bat for efficiency due to the nature of the new construction, modern construction.
Absolutely. I mean, like from a logistics standpoint, every 4 feet you go, there's incremental value from a volume standpoint, 100%. But then other real important things are column spacing. You're loading, you're turning circles, you're the parking, and just getting into a new space with doors with good quality bumpers and seals, to keep the elements. Like let's face it, we're in Canada. The winters are harsh. These little things matter. So for tenants who have had the experience of being in a building that is reaching the end of its useful life, the landlord has been reluctant to spend money in the building. Tenants also, being owners, have been reluctant to, spend the money themselves, even if it is their responsibility per the lease. But, letting, some of those, maintenance pieces slip, getting into, the opportunity to relocate into brand new space, I think, is exciting for them, like end to end, with respect to, the experience they have in that building.
So from our perspective, we definitely believe in the fundamentals of the Ottawa market. It makes all kinds of sense to have a presence there, and we definitely think that the market's going to evolve over time. I'd love to get your thoughts as to how you think it's going to evolve from obviously the industrial market. Talk about the West End, which 10 years ago was, not as much of a player as it is now. What's your prediction for the Ottawa market? Because correct me if I'm wrong, the way that I see it is that there's an opportunity now to get in before it gets to another level.
Yeah, I mean, it's the national capital. We have obviously the stability of the federal government. We have the strong, private sector, mostly in the tech world, and then of course all the services that support both tech and government. We have a growing population. As of now, close to 1.5 million when you include, the whole total CMA. As that relates to, industrial real estate, I think we're, underserved with respect to, inventory. So adding projects to that inventory now, I think is crucial. The city needs it to grow. Industry needs it to continue to invest in business, invest in people, and continue to grow the local economy to support a growing population. So I think there's an incredible opportunity now in Ottawa.
Yeah, I think you covered that very well. Like it's been in Ottawa's like this. It's been not slow, but it's been a nice controlled, right? And sort of expect that to no reason not to think that won't continue to happen.
Yeah, I agree. Ottawa doesn't share the same peaks and valleys that you'd find in other markets in Canada, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's always been
pretty consistent, and slow and steady wins the race, right? Yeah. How many other landlords or developers are putting up similar product to us?
It's a small group. You have
Avenue 31.
Avenue 31, who have been building and been very successful in the East End with the National Capital Business Park. They've done 3 buildings now, 2 of which are fully leased, and they have some space that's ready to go that they're working on leasing up. You have Manulife, who's just delivered 200,000 square feet in the East End.
They both kicked off around the same time.
Yeah, Avenue 31 was first.
Yeah.
2021, I believe. So they were first to it, and they were the benefactors of some pent-up demand.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to pull tenants from outside of the market, as well as a couple from within the market that were eager to get into some new gen space. So they were very successful with those projects. Then in the West End, I mean it's Rosefellow in Kanata. And then I know you have another site which is going to come online in due time on Dealership Drive, and then to the immediate north of you, you have Canton First with Colonnade Bridgeport, and about 1 million square feet of slated development. So they're moving dirt around and getting ready to build 2 of the 4 buildings that they have scheduled for delivery.
But historically, in Ottawa, on the office and industrial sides, it hasn't been a spec build town.
Right, exactly.
So you're definitely creating, a stir and noise by doing what you're doing in Kanata. It's been good.
We like that. Yeah, we like that. And well, look, no pressure, guys. We got to lease these puppies up, eh? We got to lease them up. So let's do some deals.
Absolutely. We're excited.
Guys, thanks for making the drive. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to collaborating you further on leasing up this project and getting on to the next one. Safe travels back home. And next time, you're wearing a Habs jersey.
I'll think about it. No, thanks for having us. Thanks for having us in. Unique experience. Love to do it again if you'll have us back. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks again for having us.
Cheers.
Great to sit down and talk about the project.